Salute the cleaning lady. Have you lost your mind, Commander? The words hung in the sterile air of St. Jude's Trauma Center like a slap across the face. But Commander Cole Harrington didn't flinch, didn't waver, didn't so much as blink at the surgeon's outrage. He simply raised his hand, bandaged and trembling from the effort, and pressed it to his forehead in the crispest military salute anyone in that hospital had ever witnessed. The hallway went silent. Nurses froze mid-step. Doctors clutched their clipboards like shields. Even the constant beeping of the monitors seemed to fade into nothing, as every eye in that corridor followed the commander's gaze to the woman standing at the end of the hall. She wasn't a doctor. She wasn't even a proper nurse, according to the gossip that had circulated through these halls for weeks. She was the quiet one, the invisible one, the middle-aged woman in scrubs 2 sizes too big who changed bedpans and mopped floors, and never spoke more than a handful of words to anyone. They had called her the mute behind her back, sometimes to her face. They had called her the liability, the maid, and worse things that they thought she couldn't hear through the thin break-room walls. But there she stood, this woman they had dismissed and mocked, and tried to force out of their prestigious hospital, and a Navy SEAL commander, one of the most decorated special operations officers in American military history, was saluting her like she was the President of the United States. The woman's ice blue eyes glistened just for a moment before she straightened her spine and gave him the slightest nod of acknowledgement. It was the nod of someone who understood exactly what that salute meant and what it had cost him to give it. 72 hours earlier, none of them knew that the woman they laughed at would become the only thing standing between a dying hero and the assassin sent to finish him. 72 hours earlier, they thought she was nobody. They were wrong. 3 weeks before that salute changed everything, the break room of Ward 4 West was filled with the kind of laughter that was designed to wound. It wasn't the warm laughter of friends sharing a joke over coffee. Oh no, this was the sharp, jagged kind of laughter that echoed through thin drywall, specifically because the people laughing wanted their target to hear every single word. Dr. Preston Ashworth leaned back in his leather chair, the one he had personally requested for the break room because the standard hospital furniture wasn't good enough for a surgeon of his caliber, and let out a theatrical sigh of disgust. I asked her for a clamp, and she handed me a hemostat, he announced to the room, shaking his head like a disappointed parent. I swear to God, HR must be scraping the absolute bottom of the barrel these days. She looks like she wandered in from a bus stop and decided to play dress-up. Victoria Lane, the head surgical nurse, who everyone called Vicky, and who had perfected the art of cruelty, disguised as concern, stirred her oat milk latte and nodded sympathetically. She's 45 if she's a day, Preston. Who starts a nursing rotation at 45? And have you seen her hands? They shake like leaves in a windstorm. I watched her trembling when she was prepping the IV tray for Mrs. Patterson yesterday, and I thought she was going to drop the whole thing on the floor. Probably the DT's doctor. Ashworth muttered, checking his Rolex with the casual arrogance of a man who believed his time was worth more than everyone else's combined. Alcoholic or burned out, take your pick. Either way, I want her out of my operating room. If she so much as touches a patient during one of my procedures, I'm filing a formal complaint with administration, and I'm going to make sure everyone knows exactly whose fault it is when something goes wrong. Chad Morrison, a second-year resident with a smirk that seemed permanently etched onto his face and an ego that far exceeded his actual medical skills, snorted from his position by the coffee machine. Did you see her shuffling down the hallway yesterday? Like a zombie in scrubs? I bet she couldn't find her way out of a paper bag, let alone assist in surgery. The laughter that followed was loud and cruel, and it carried easily through the thin walls of the break room into the hallway beyond. Outside that door, Sarah Brennan stood perfectly still. She had been carrying a tray of sterilized instruments to the supply closet, and she had heard every single word they said about her. The mute, the maid, the liability, the woman who looked like she wandered in from a bus stop. She didn't storm in to defend herself. She didn't cry. She didn't even flinch. She simply adjusted the collar of her scrub top, the blue standard issue one that hung loosely on her frame, hiding the wiry, hardened body beneath, and she walked away. But if anyone had been watching closely, if anyone had bothered to look at the woman they had all dismissed as invisible, they might have noticed something flash in her ice blue eyes. Something cold. Something dangerous. It was there and gone in less than a second, like lightning on a distant horizon. Sarah had been at St. Jude's for 3 weeks now, and in that time, she had spoken less than 100 words. She took every grunt job they threw at her, changing bedpans and sanitizing surfaces, and restocking supply carts, and all the other tasks that the younger, more prestigious nurses considered beneath them. She took the graveyard shifts that nobody wanted, the ones that stretched from midnight until dawn, when the hospital was quiet and the shadows were long. She took the ridicule and the mockery and the barely concealed contempt, and she never once complained. They thought her silence meant she was weak. They thought her acceptance of the worst jobs meant she was desperate. They thought the way she shuffled her feet and hunched her shoulders meant she was timid and afraid. They were wrong about all of it. The night shift at St. Jude's had a rhythm to it that most people never noticed. The fluorescent lights hummed at a slightly different frequency after midnight, casting everything in a pale, ghostly glow that made the hospital feel like a place between worlds. The usual chaos of the day shift faded into something quieter, more contemplative, as the skeleton crew moved through the halls like spirits tending to the sleeping. Sarah moved through this in-between world like she belonged there, which in many ways she did. She was invisible to most of the staff, just another figure in scrubs, pushing a cart of supplies from one room to another. And that invisibility suited her purposes perfectly. But if someone had been paying attention, really paying attention, they would have noticed things about Sarah Brennan that didn't quite fit the image she projected. They might have noticed, for instance, what happened when a metal tray crashed to the floor in the cafeteria 3 floors below. The sound echoed up through the building's ventilation system, a sudden clatter that made everyone in the vicinity jump in surprise. Everyone except Sarah. She didn't jump. She didn't even flinch. Instead, in the space of half a heartbeat, her weight shifted to the balls of her feet. Her knees bent almost imperceptibly, and her eyes, those pale ice blue eyes, swept across every exit in the corridor before anyone else had even registered what the sound was. It happened so fast that if you blinked, you would have missed it entirely. And then she was back to her shuffling, hunched posture, as if nothing had happened at all. They might have noticed the way her forearms looked when she lifted a heavy box of supplies, the way the muscles rippled and flexed, with a strength that seemed completely at odds with her small, timid appearance. They might have noticed the scars that traced jagged paths across her forearms, scars that weren't from kitchen accidents or clumsy falls, but from something far more violent. Those scars were from shrapnel. They might have noticed the way her fingers tapped against her thigh when she was waiting for an elevator, a rhythmic pattern that meant nothing to most people, but would have been instantly recognizable to anyone who knew Morse code. Tap, 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 tap. Over and over again, an unconscious habit that she probably wasn't even aware of anymore. SOS. The truth was that Sarah's hands did shake, but not from alcohol or burnout, or any of the other explanations that Dr. Ashworth and his colleagues had invented to explain away her tremors. Her hands shook from the phantom vibrations of Black Hawk rotors, from the bone-deep memory of 20 years spent in helicopters, flying into places where death waited around every corner. Her hands shook because for 2 decades they had been covered in the blood of young soldiers who cried out for their mothers in the dust and chaos of Kandahar or Fallujah, of black sites and classified locations that the government would never admit existed. Sarah Brennan wasn't just a new nurse struggling to fit in at a prestigious hospital. She was former Lieutenant Sarah Brennan, United States Air Force call sign Angel. She was a specialized pararescue jumper and combat medic who had been attached to Tier 1 Special Operations units, the kind of units that conducted missions so secret that even their existence was classified. She had pulled wounded operators out of firefights while bullets cracked past her head. She had performed emergency surgery in the back of helicopters with nothing but a flashlight in her bare hands. She had seen things and done things that would give most people nightmares for the rest of their lives. She had retired 3 years ago after an IED explosion in a convoy killed half her team and left her with a traumatic brain injury and a spine held together with titanium rods. The explosion had taken more than her health. It had taken her brother Daniel, who had been riding in the vehicle right behind hers. She had come to St. Jude's not for the money, which was pitiful compared to what she could have earned as a private military contractor, and not for the prestige, which was non-existent given how they treated her. She had come because she needed the noise. The silence of retirement was too loud, too full of memories and ghosts, and the screaming that never quite stopped in the back of her mind. She needed the beeping of monitors, and the rush of emergencies, and the constant low-level chaos of a hospital to drown out the other sounds that haunted her. She had promised herself that there would be no heroics this time, no combat, no putting herself in harm's way. Just quiet care, just being useful, just making it through each day until the next one came. She was failing at the quiet part. In her locker, hidden behind her spare scrubs and her lunch bag, there was a photograph. It showed two young soldiers in desert camouflage, their arms around each other's shoulders, grinning at the camera with the invincible confidence of youth. One of them was Sarah, 15 years younger and a lifetime ago. The other was a young man with the same ice blue eyes, the same stubborn set to his jaw. Her brother, Daniel. And in the background of that photograph, barely visible, but unmistakably, there stood a younger version of Commander Cole Harrington. The rain started around midnight, a cold and relentless assault that hammered against the windows of St. Jude's like it was trying to break through the glass. Sarah stood at the window of the fourth-floor supply room, watching the water streak down the pane and turn the parking lot below into a blur of reflected lights. Something was wrong. She could feel it in her bones and the prickling sensation at the back of her neck that had saved her life more times than she could count. The hospital was too quiet tonight, even for the graveyard shift. The usual background noise of a trauma center, the conversations and the footsteps and the endless beeping of machines had faded to almost nothing, like the building itself was holding its breath. She scanned the parking lot below her eyes, picking out details that most people would have missed entirely. 3 black SUVs sat in the visitor lot positioned near the main entrance. They hadn't been there an hour ago when she had looked out this same window. Their engines were off and their lights were dark, but she could see the faint wisps of exhaust rising from their tailpipes into the cold night air. They were waiting. She noticed other things. 2 small details that added up to a picture she didn't like at all. The security guard at the main desk had been checking his phone every 30 seconds for the past hour, and each time he looked at it, his face got a little more pale. The emergency stairwell door on the ground floor had been propped open with a fire extinguisher, which was a serious safety violation that no one seemed to be addressing. And her cell phone, which usually had 4 bars of signal in this part of the building, was showing only 1 bar and dropping. Someone was jamming the signals. Someone was preparing for something. Sarah walked the halls of the 4th floor, ostensibly doing her rounds, but actually mapping every exit route, every supply closet, every blind spot in the security camera coverage. She noted which closets contained oxygen tanks, which could be used as improvised weapons in a pinch. She counted the ceiling tiles and calculated distances and identified positions where a person could hide and wait for an attacker to pass. Old habits didn't die. They just went dormant until they were needed again. She stopped at her locker one more time and looked at the photograph of her and Daniel. Her fingers traced the outline of his face, the brother she had failed to save, and then moved to the figure in the background. Commander Cole Harrington. The man who had been there when Daniel died. The man who had held her brother's hand in those final moments when she couldn't be there. The man who was carrying classified files that exposed a conspiracy of corruption so vast that powerful people would do anything, absolutely anything, to make sure those files never saw the light of day. She had known he would come to St. Jude's eventually. She had known that the people who wanted him dead would follow. She had spent 3 years tracking the conspiracy that had killed her brother, 3 years following threads that led to defense contractors and corrupt politicians and mercenary companies that operated in the shadows. She had come to this hospital and endured the mockery and the contempt and the endless humiliation because she knew that eventually the storm would arrive. And now, watching the black SUVs in the parking lot and feeling the wrongness in the air, she knew that the waiting was almost over. Sarah pulled a scalpel from the supply room and slipped it into her pocket. She positioned an oxygen tank behind the door of Commander Harrington's room within easy reach. She moved his bed away from the window just in case. Then, she pulled a chair to the doorway of his room, sat down in the darkness, and waited for whatever was coming next. The hospital PA system crackled to life at exactly 2:47 a.m., and the sound that came through the speakers was unlike anything the night shift had heard before. 3 sharp electronic blasts, each one more urgent than the last, followed by a voice that was trying very hard to sound calm and failing completely. Code Black. Trauma Bay 1. Code Black. Mass casualty event reported. VIP transfer incoming. ETA 3 minutes. All available personnel to Trauma Bay 1 immediately. This is not a drill. Repeat, this is not a drill. The effect was instantaneous. The break room emptied like someone had pulled a fire alarm. Coffee cups abandoned and phones forgotten as doctors and nurses sprinted toward the trauma bay. Dr. Preston Ashworth was already barking orders as he ran down the corridor, his Rolex flashing under the fluorescent lights as he gestured wildly at anyone within earshot. Vicky, I need you to prep Bay 1 full trauma setup, and I mean full, not the half-assed job you did last week. Chad, get the blood bank on the line and tell them to have O-negative standing by as much as they can spare. This is it, people. We have VIPs coming in from the airfield, and I will not have my reputation damaged by incompetence. Move, move, move. Sarah stood by the linen cart in the hallway, watching the chaos unfold around her. She wasn't assigned to Trauma Bay 1. According to the duty roster, she was supposed to be cleaning the waiting room on the second floor, scrubbing the chairs and emptying the trash cans, while the real medical professionals handled the real emergencies. But then she heard it. Cutting through the wail of the approaching ambulance sirens, cutting through the shouted orders and the pounding footsteps, there was another sound. A sound that made her blood freeze in her veins and then immediately turn to fire. The rhythmic thumping of helicopter rotors, but not the light quick beat of a civilian medevac chopper. This was heavier, deeper, the distinctive thump-thump-thump of military-grade engines pushing against the night air. That was a PAVE Hawk. A special operations helicopter, the kind that carried Tier 1 operators into the worst places on Earth, and if they were lucky, brought them back out again. Sarah dropped the mop she had been holding. It clattered against the linoleum floor, but no one was paying attention to the cleaning lady anymore. Everyone was too focused on the chaos ahead. Something had gone wrong. Something had gone very, very wrong. The doors of Trauma Bay 1 didn't open so much as they exploded inward, slamming against the walls with enough force to crack the plaster. The smell hit everyone first, that unmistakable copper tang of fresh blood mixed with cordite, and something else. Something that spoke of violence and desperation and the thin line between life and death. The paramedics came through first, moving with the controlled urgency of people who had seen too much to panic anymore. Behind them came two massive men in plain clothes, but everything about them screamed military, from the tactical headsets in their ears to the way their eyes never stopped scanning the room for threats. They flanked a stretcher that was covered in so much blood and medical equipment that it was hard to tell where one ended and the other began. The patient was a mess of wires and blood-soaked gauze, and what looked horrifyingly like shattered bone poking through torn flesh. Male, probably in his 40s, though it was hard to tell through all the damage. Multiple gunshot wounds to the chest, entrance wounds that Sarah's trained eye immediately recognized as the work of 7.62 mm rounds, probably from a suppressed rifle, given the lack of powder burns around the edges. This wasn't a random shooting. This was a professional hit. Male, mid-40s, multiple GSW to the thoracic cavity, the lead paramedic shouted, his voice cracking under the strain. BP is 60/40 and dropping fast. We lost his pulse twice in the bird, brought him back both times, but he's circling the drain. You need to work fast or you're going to lose him. Dr. Ashworth pushed his way to the front of the crowd, his ego swelling to fill the room even as his hands trembled slightly at the sight of so much blood. I've got this, he announced, his voice carrying the false confidence of a man who was already in over his head. Clear the way, everyone. Get a line in him type and cross-match for O-negative stat. And somebody get these military people out of my operating room. One of the tactical men, a bearded giant with a scar running down the side of his neck, like a pale lightning bolt, grabbed Ashworth's sleeve with a grip that made the surgeon wince. His voice was low and dangerous, the voice of a man who had killed people with his bare hands and would do it again without hesitation. Listen to me very carefully, Doctor. This is Commander Cole Harrington. He is one of the most important men in the United States military. And if you lose him on your table tonight, there is no hole on this earth deep enough for you to hide in. Do you understand me? Ashworth yanked his arm away, his face flushing with indignation and fear in equal measure. Get these men out of my operating room, he snapped at the security guards. I am trying to save a life here, and I don't need amateurs telling me how to do my job. The tactical men were escorted out, but the tension they left behind was thick enough to choke on. On the table, Commander Cole Harrington was dying. The monitor beside him screamed a flat, dissonant tone that every person in that room recognized as the sound of a heart giving up. He's coding, Nurse Vicky! Screamed, her composure cracking for the first time. V-fib, we need paddles now! Charged to 200, Ashworth yelled, grabbing the defibrillator paddles. Clear. The body on the table jerked with the electrical shock, but the monitor kept screaming its terrible flatline song. Nothing. Charged to 300, clear. Another jolt, another failure. Ashworth was sweating now, his confident facade crumbling as the reality of the situation set in. There was arterial spray hitting the floor with every chest compression. Bright red blood pumping out of the commander's body faster than they could possibly replace it. Where is the bleeder? Ashworth shouted, his hands moving frantically through the chest wounds. I can't see anything through this mess. There's too much blood, I can't find the source. In the corner of the room, unnoticed by everyone focused on the dying man, Sarah Brennan had slipped through the chaos. She wasn't supposed to be here. She was supposed to be mopping floors and emptying trash cans, invisible and useless as always. But she was watching. She was watching the monitor, and she was watching the blood. And she was seeing something that Dr. Preston Ashworth, for all his prestigious degrees and Instagram followers, had completely missed. The commander's abdomen was distended, swollen tight as a drum beneath the blood-soaked hospital gown. The chest wounds were serious, yes, but they weren't the only source of the bleeding. There was something else. Something hidden. Something that was killing him, while everyone focused on the obvious injuries. He's got a junctional hemorrhage, Sarah whispered, but her voice was lost in the chaos of the room. Charge to 360, Ashworth screamed, desperation cracking his voice. We are losing him. People, we are losing him. Sarah moved. It wasn't a conscious decision. There was no moment where Sarah weighed the pros and cons, calculated the risks, considered what would happen to her career if she intervened. 20 years of combat medicine had burned those calculations out of her brain, replacing them with pure instinct with muscle memory that took over when thinking would take too long. She stepped past Chad Morrison, who was standing frozen near the instrument tray with his mouth hanging open. He saw her coming and tried to block her path, his face twisting with that same smug contempt he always showed her. Get out of here, janitor, he hissed. This is an operating room, not a cleaning closet. You don't belong here. Sarah didn't slow down. She didn't argue. She didn't explain. She simply drove her shoulder into his sternum with enough force to lift him off his feet and send him crashing backward into a cart of surgical instruments. The cart toppled with a tremendous crash, scattering scalpels and clamps across the floor. And Chad went down hard, gasping for breath like a fish pulled out of water. Every head in the room turned toward the sound. Dr. Ashworth looked up from the dying patient, his eyes widening with disbelief and rage at the sight of the quiet, invisible cleaning lady standing in the middle of his operating room. What the hell do you think you're doing? He roared. Security. Get this woman out of here immediately. She's contaminating my surgical field. Sarah ignored him completely. She had already reached the operating table, and her eyes were locked on something that Ashworth hadn't even thought to look for. The commander's upper thigh, high up near the groin, hidden beneath the shredded remains of his tactical pants. The fabric was so dark with blood that it had blended into the shadows, invisible to anyone who wasn't specifically looking for it. But Sarah was looking, and she saw it. A small wound, almost insignificant compared to the massive chest trauma, but leaking blood in a steady pulsing stream that matched the weak rhythm of the commander's failing heart. The femoral artery, nicked by a bullet fragment, bleeding internally, disguised by the more obvious injuries above. Every chest compression they performed was pumping blood out of his body through that hidden wound. They were killing him while trying to save him. He's bleeding out from the femoral, Sarah said, and her voice was completely different now. Gone was the quiet, hesitant whisper of the timid new nurse. This was a command voice, a voice that had directed fire teams under mortar attack, a voice that expected to be obeyed without question. Stop the compressions immediately. You're pumping his blood onto the floor. You are fired. Ashworth screamed, his face purple with fury. Get away from my patient right now, or I will have you arrested for assault and practicing medicine without a license. Sarah didn't flinch. She didn't hesitate. She didn't waste a single second on the screaming surgeon or the stunned nurses or the security guards who were pushing their way into the room. She jammed her entire gloved fist into the open wound on the commander's thigh. The sound that went through the room was somewhere between a gasp and a scream. Vicky actually stumbled backward, her hand pressed to her mouth in horror. Chad, still on the floor, made a retching sound. Even Ashworth fell silent, too shocked by what he was seeing to form words. Sarah's arm disappeared up to the wrist in the commander's leg. Her fingers found the pulsing vessel slippery with blood, and she pressed down hard, compressing the femoral artery against the pelvic bone with a technique that was brutal and agonizing, and absolutely the only thing that could save his life in the 30 seconds he had left. The arterial spray slowed. The monitor beeped. Once. Twice. Then it settled into a weak but steady rhythm, the sound of a heart that had been given one more chance. I need a Foley catheter and a vascular clamp, Sarah said, her voice steady as stone. and someone needs to get me a unit of O negative before my arm goes numb. Now. No one moved. They all just stared at her, at this woman who had transformed before their eyes from a timid cleaning lady into something else entirely. Something terrifying and magnificent, and completely beyond their understanding. Now, Sarah barked, and the spell broke. The surgery took 6 hours. Dr. Ashworth performed it, technically speaking. His name would be on the charts and the reports, and whatever commendations might eventually be issued. But everyone who was in that operating room knew the truth. Every single instruction, every decision about where to cut and what to repair, and how to stop the bleeding that kept finding new ways to threaten the commander's life, came from the quiet woman who had walked in off the cleaning crew and saved a man's life with her bare fist. Sarah stayed for all of it, standing in the corner of the OR in borrowed surgical scrubs, watching and directing and occasionally stepping in when Ashworth's hands trembled too badly to continue. By the time they wheeled Commander Harrington into the ICU, the sun was coming up over Seattle, and Sarah hadn't slept in over 24 hours. She didn't leave his side. The hospital administration didn't know what to do with her. Ashworth wanted her arrested, or at least fired and banned from the premises, but the tactical men who had accompanied the commander made it very clear that anyone who touched Sarah Brennan would answer to people far more frightening than a hospital HR department. So she sat in the chair beside his bed, watching the monitors and the IV drip and the slow rise and fall of his chest, and she waited. It was nearly noon when his eyes finally opened. The morphine fog was thick. Sarah could see it in the way his pupils struggled to focus, but something cut through that haze when his gaze found her face. Recognition. Not the kind that came from gratitude for a medical, save not the simple acknowledgement of a stranger who had helped him. This was something deeper, something older, something that made Sarah's hands start trembling again, after hours of being perfectly steady. Angel, he whispered, his voice like sandpaper over broken glass. Sarah's breath caught in her throat. They told you were dead, he continued, each word an effort. Fallujah, 2019. They said the convoy. They said no one survived. Almost no one, Sarah said quietly. The commander's eyes, green and piercing, even through the drug, studied her face. Mitchell, he breathed. You're Daniel's sister. I remember now. He showed me your picture. He talked about you all the time. Sarah felt something crack in her chest. A wall she had built 3 years ago to keep herself functioning, to keep herself moving forward instead of drowning in grief. He died saving you, she said, and her voice was steady even as her hands shook. I've spent 3 years trying to find out why. I've spent 3 years tracking the people who set up that ambush, the people who knew exactly where your convoy would be and when. Harrington's hand found her wrist, his grip weak but desperate. You know about Blackwell. I know everything. The defense contracts, the bribes, the senators on their payroll. I know they killed my brother to protect their secrets, and I know you have the files that can bring them down. They're coming, Harrington said, his eyes suddenly alert with fear. Blackwell knows I'm here. They'll send people. They'll burn this whole hospital to the ground if they have to. Sarah looked at the door, then back at the commander. I know, she said. I've been waiting for them. The hospital had gone quiet in a way that Sarah recognized immediately, and the recognition sent ice water running through her veins. This wasn't the peaceful quiet of a building at rest, wasn't the natural lull that came in the small hours between midnight and dawn. This was the quiet of a place holding its breath, the unnatural silence that preceded violence. She had felt this silence before, in the moments before an ambush, in the heartbeats before the first shot was fired, in the terrible pause between the click of a trigger and the explosion that followed. It was the silence of predators circling their prey, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. The clock on the wall read 2:00 a.m. Commander Harrington had finally fallen into a fitful sleep, his body desperately trying to heal from the trauma it had endured. Sarah stood at the window of his room, watching the parking lot 4 stories below, and what she saw confirmed every fear that had been building in her gut since she first noticed those black SUVs. There were 7 of them, now positioned at every exit from the hospital, their engines off, but their occupants clearly visible as shadows behind tinted glass. More concerning were the men she spotted on foot, moving with the practiced casualness of professionals who were very good at not being noticed. They were taking positions around the perimeter, covering sight lines, blocking escape routes. This wasn't a rescue operation. This was an assault force preparing to breach. Sarah moved quickly but quietly, her mind shifting into a mode she hadn't used in 3 years. She checked the emergency stairwell, noting that someone had disabled the alarm on the door. She tested her cell phone and found the signal completely dead, now jammed by equipment that was probably sitting in one of those SUVs. She tried the landline at the nurse's station and heard nothing but static. They were cut off, isolated, trapped. She found Jessica Tate, the young nurse who had never been particularly cruel to her, but had never stood up for her either, restocking supplies in the medication room. The girl looked up with surprise when Sarah appeared in the doorway, her eyes widening at whatever she saw in the older woman's face. "I need you to listen to me very carefully." Sarah said, her voice low and urgent. "I need you to move all the patients on this floor to interior rooms away from windows and exterior walls. Do it quietly. Don't cause a panic and don't ask me questions because we don't have time." "What's happening?" Jessica whispered, fear creeping into her voice. "Is this about the commander? Is someone coming for him?" "Just do what I asked. Please." Something in Sarah's tone must have conveyed the seriousness of the situation, because Jessica nodded and hurried off without another word. Sarah watched her go, then continued her preparations. She found an oxygen tank in a supply closet and positioned it behind the door of Harrington's room within easy reach. She located fire extinguishers on every floor and memorized their positions. She identified which ceiling tiles were loose enough to push aside, which air vents were large enough for a person to crawl through, which supply closets had locks that could be barricaded from the inside. She was mapping a battlefield because that's exactly what this hospital was about to become. The scalpel she had taken earlier was still in her pocket. A pitiful weapon against the firepower that was gathering outside, but it was better than nothing. She found a roll of surgical tape and wrapped the handle to improve her grip. She found a heavy flashlight that could double as a club. She found a bottle of surgical-grade alcohol that could be turned into an improvised incendiary device if things got desperate enough. Old habits didn't die. They just waited for the moment when they were needed again. Sarah returned to Harrington's room and pulled a chair to the doorway. She sat down in the darkness facing the corridor, and she waited. The silence pressed in around her like a physical weight. And then at exactly 2:47 a.m., the silence shattered. The front doors of St. Jude's Hospital didn't open. They exploded inward with a concussive blast that shattered the reinforced glass into 1,000 razor-sharp fragments spraying across the lobby like deadly rain. The sound was enormous, a thunderclap of violence that echoed through every floor of the building and announced with absolute clarity that the rules of civilization no longer applied here. 12 men poured through the breach before the glass had even finished falling. They moved with the fluid precision of operators who had done this 100 times before, fanning out to cover every angle, their weapons sweeping the lobby with laser sights that cut through the dust and smoke like red fingers of death. They wore black tactical gear, suppressed rifles, night vision equipment, all the tools of a professional kill team. The night security guard, a retired cop named Wilson, who had been looking forward to a quiet shift of crossword puzzles and bad coffee, barely had time to reach for his weapon before one of the operatives put a round through his shoulder. He went down screaming, clutching the wound, and 2 more operatives zip-tied his hands behind his back before dragging him behind the reception desk. "Building is secure," one of the operatives announced into his radio. "Lobby team in position. All exits covered. Awaiting primary." The man who walked through the shattered doors next was not dressed like the others. He wore a simple black jacket over a dark sweater. No tactical gear, no visible weapons. Just the calm confidence of someone who didn't need to carry a gun because he had 12 men who would kill or die at his command. Victor Kessler was 45 years old with a scar that ran along his jawline like a pale crack in weathered stone and eyes that held absolutely nothing resembling human warmth. He had been Special Forces once decorated and respected until an incident in Syria had resulted in a dishonorable discharge and a one-way ticket to the private sector. Now he worked for Blackwell Defense Corporation, handling the kind of problems that couldn't be solved through lawyers or lobbyists. Problems like Commander Cole Harrington and the classified files he carried. Kessler surveyed the lobby with the detached interest of a butcher examining livestock. Staff members cowered behind desks and gurneys, their faces white with terror, their phones useless thanks to the signal jammers his team had activated 20 minutes ago. The elevators had been disabled remotely, the emergency exits sealed from outside the landlines cut. This hospital was now a closed system, a killing box, and everyone inside it belonged to him. Listen carefully. Kessler announced, his voice carrying easily through the stunned silence. "We are here for one patient only. Commander Cole Harrington, currently located in the ICU on the 4th floor. Anyone who cooperates fully will be released unharmed when our business is concluded. Anyone who interferes will be dealt with accordingly." He paused, letting the implications sink in. "My men are going to search this building floor by floor. If Commander Harrington is delivered to me within the next 30 minutes, no one else needs to die tonight. If he is not..." Kessler shrugged with theatrical indifference. "Well, hospitals are such dangerous places. So many things can go wrong." He gestured to his team leaders. "Secure all floors. Find the commander. And find anyone who might be helping him." The operatives moved out, splitting into teams of 3, heading for the stairwells with their weapons raised and their night vision equipment glowing green in the emergency lighting. 4 floors above Sarah Brennan heard the explosion and felt the building shudder around her. She heard the distant screams and the sharp crack of suppressed gunfire. She heard heavy boots on the stairs getting closer with every passing second. She looked at Commander Harrington, who had awakened at the sound of the blast and was already struggling to sit up despite his wounds. "How many?" he asked, his voice tight with pain, but his eyes clear and focused. "At least 12. Sarah replied, moving to help him stand. Professional team suppressed weapons coordinated entry. This is a Blackwell operation. Can we fight through them? Not directly. But I know this hospital better than they do." She pressed a pistol into his hand, a weapon she had taken from one of the tactical men who had accompanied him and hidden in the supply closet. "Can you shoot?" Harrington checked the magazine with practiced efficiency despite his wounds. "I can shoot. Then stay behind me, conserve your ammunition, and don't die. I didn't spend 3 years hunting these people just to lose you now." The first team of operatives reached the 4th floor at exactly 3:02 a.m. There were 3 of them, moving in a standard clearing formation, their rifles sweeping each doorway as they advanced down the corridor toward the ICU. They were good. Sarah noted, watching them from the shadows of a supply closet with the door cracked just enough to see. Their movements were smooth and professional, their communication silent but efficient, their confidence absolute. They had no idea what they were walking into. The lead operative reached Commander Harrington's room and found it empty. The bed was still warm, the IV lines dangling where they had been hastily disconnected, but the patient was gone. He keyed his radio to report, and that was when Sarah stepped out of the darkness behind him. She moved like smoke, like silence given physical form, closing the distance in 3 quick strides that made no sound at all on the linoleum floor. The operative never heard her coming. He never saw the scalpel that sliced through the tendons of his weapon hand, never understood why his rifle suddenly clattered to the floor, never had time to scream before her other hand closed around his throat and drove him backward into the wall. She used his own body weight against him, redirecting his momentum, controlling his limbs with techniques that had been drilled into her muscle memory through years of close-quarters combat training. Her knee found his solar plexus, driving the air from his lungs. Her elbow found his temple, and his eyes rolled back as consciousness fled. 3 seconds. 1 operative down. The second man heard something and turned his rifle, coming up his finger, finding the trigger. Sarah was already moving, using the falling body of the first operative as a shield, closing the distance before he could get a clean shot. She caught his weapon by the barrel and redirected it toward the ceiling as he fired the suppressed round, punching a hole in the acoustic tiles above their heads. Her palm strike found his nose, shattering cartilage, and as he staggered backwards, she ripped the rifle from his grip and drove the stock into his jaw with enough force to spin him completely around before he collapsed. 5 seconds. 2 operatives down. The third man was faster than the others. He had already dropped to one knee, creating distance, his weapon trained on Sarah's center mass. She saw his finger tightening on the trigger and knew she couldn't close the gap in time. The shot that rang out came from behind her. Commander Harrington stood braced against the doorframe of a patient room, the pistol Sarah had given him, smoking in his trembling hands. The operative looked down at the red bloom spreading across his chest with an expression of profound confusion before he toppled forward onto his face. "I told you I could shoot," Harrington said, and then his legs gave out and he slid down the doorframe to the floor. Sarah moved quickly, stripping the downed operatives of their weapons and equipment. She took a rifle, 2 spare magazines, a tactical radio, and a set of night vision goggles. She helped Harrington back to his feet and pressed a second pistol into his hands. "We need to move," she said. "That gunshot wasn't suppressed." They'll know exactly where we are. As if to confirm her words, the radio she had taken crackled to life with Victor Kessler's cold, measured voice. Team 2 report. Team 2 acknowledge. Sarah looked at the radio in her hand. She looked at Harrington, and then with a smile that held no warmth at all, she keyed the transmit button. Team 2 is unavailable right now. Can I take a message? The silence that followed Sarah's transmission stretched for nearly 10 seconds, an eternity in tactical terms, and she could almost feel the shock rippling through Kessler's forces as they processed what had just happened. 3 of their best operators taken down by someone in a hospital full of doctors and nurses and patients, and the voice on the radio didn't sound like any medical professional they had ever encountered. When Kessler's voice came back, it was different. The bored professional detachment was gone, replaced by something colder and far more dangerous. Angel, Sarah Brennan. He said the name like it was a curse, each syllable dripping with barely controlled rage. I should have known. When my people told me there was a new nurse at St. Jude's, a woman who kept to herself and didn't talk to anyone, I should have looked more closely. Sarah kept moving as she listened, guiding Harrington through the maze of corridors toward the service stairwell at the back of the building. Hello, Victor. You look terrible. The years haven't been kind. You left me to die in Mosul. You left your own men to die in Mosul. I just made sure you paid for it. Sarah paused at a junction, checking both directions before continuing. I'm surprised Blackwell hired you after that. They must have been desperate. They hired me because I get results. Kessler's voice tightened with fury. And tonight's result is going to be your corpse delivered to my employers, along with everything Commander Harrington knows. You should have stayed dead, Angel. You should have stayed hidden in whatever hole you crawled into after Fallujah. I couldn't do that, Victor. Your employers killed my brother. A pause. When Kessler spoke again, there was a new note in his voice, something that might have been understanding if he were capable of such emotion. Daniel Brennan, the medic. That's why you came here. That's why you've been waiting. 3 years, Sarah confirmed. 3 years of tracking every thread, every connection, every dirty dollar that Blackwell has ever touched. I know about the bribes. I know about the senators. I know about the ambush that was set up to kill Commander Harrington and silence everyone who knew about your operation. My brother died in that ambush, Victor. He died saving the man you're trying to kill tonight. Then you know that none of this ends well for you, Kessler replied. You're trapped in a building with no communications, no backup, and no way out. My men are going to find you, and when they do, I'm going to make you watch while I put a bullet in Commander Harrington's head. And then I'm going to take my time with you. Sarah stopped walking. She raised the radio to her lips and spoke with perfect, terrifying calm. Victor, I want you to listen very carefully to what I'm about to tell you. I have killed more men than you have ever commanded. I have survived things that would break your mind just to hear about. And I have spent 3 years preparing for this exact moment, studying this hospital, learning every corridor and air vent and blind spot in the security system, waiting for you to make exactly this mistake. She smiled in the darkness, even though no one could see it. You didn't trap me in here with you. You trapped yourself in here with me. And you should have stayed dead when I gave you the chance. She dropped the radio and crushed it under her heel. The next 45 minutes were the longest of Sarah Brennan's life. And that was saying something for a woman who had spent 20 years in the most dangerous places on Earth. She moved through the hospital like a ghost Commander Harrington, struggling to keep pace behind her as she led them through service corridors and maintenance passages that weren't on any official floor plan. She had spent 3 weeks memorizing this building, walking every hallway, opening every door, mapping every possible route of escape or ambush. Now that knowledge was paying dividends. They encountered 2 more teams of operatives in the stairwells and took them down with a combination of tactical superiority and sheer brutal efficiency. Sarah used the hospital itself as a weapon, weaponizing fire extinguishers and oxygen tanks and medical equipment in ways that the Blackwell mercenaries never anticipated. She used the overhead PA system to broadcast conflicting orders, creating confusion and drawing teams away from their actual position. But it wasn't enough. There were too many of them, and Harrington was fading fast. The stress of movement was reopening his wounds, and Sarah could see the fresh blood seeping through his bandages with every step. They had made it to the 2nd floor when salvation arrived in the form of heavy gunfire from the lobby below. Sarah risked a glance over the railing and saw 4 men in civilian clothes fighting their way through the ground floor, their movements identifying them instantly as military operators, even without the tactical gear. Reaper Harrington breathed, recognizing the lead figure despite the chaos. "That's my team." They must have been monitoring the situation from outside. Sarah didn't waste time on questions. She grabbed Harrington's arm and hauled him toward the main stairwell, where the sounds of combat were growing louder with every passing second. They burst through the door onto the ground floor, just as the last of Kessler's lobby guards went down. Derek Holloway, callsign Reaper, turned at the sound of their approach, his weapon snapping toward them before recognition kicked in, and he lowered the barrel. He was a big man, scarred and weathered, with the calm eyes of someone who had seen everything the world had to offer and wasn't impressed. "Commander," he said, nodding to Harrington. Then his gaze shifted to Sarah, and something like respect flickered across his features. "You must be Angel. We've been listening to the radio chatter." "Sounds like you've been busy. We need to move," Sarah replied. "How many more are there? Kessler's got at least 6 men left plus himself. They're regrouping on the roof, probably calling for extraction." Reaper checked his ammunition and grimaced. "We're almost dry. Fought our way through the perimeter teams, but we've got maybe 2 magazines between us. Then we take their helicopter," Sarah said. "It's our only way out." The roof access door exploded outward under the force of Reaper's breaching charge, and Sarah was the first one through, moving low and fast with her rifle up and her eyes scanning for targets. The rain had started again, sheets of cold water hammering down from the black sky, turning the helipad into a treacherous surface of slick concrete and pooling water. The helicopter was there, rotors spinning at idle, ready for immediate extraction. And between Sarah's team and that helicopter stood Victor Kessler and 6 of his remaining operatives, their weapons trained on the door, with the patient confidence of men who had been expecting exactly this. "End of the line," Angel Kessler called out, his voice carrying over the roar of the helicopter and the pounding rain. He stood slightly apart from his men, seemingly unconcerned about the weapons pointed in his direction. "You fought well, better than I expected, but this is where it ends." Sarah stepped forward, positioning herself between Kessler and Commander Harrington, who was barely standing now with Reaper's arm around his waist for support. The other operators spread out behind her, forming a thin defensive line that everyone knew wouldn't survive a sustained firefight. "Let me tell you how this is going to go." Kessler continued pacing slowly with theatrical calm. "You're going to hand over Commander Harrington and the files he's carrying. In exchange, I'll let you and your friends walk away. You'll disappear, start new lives somewhere far from here, and we'll pretend this never happened." And the Commander Kessler shrugged. He knows too much. He's seen too much. There's no deal that includes him breathing at the end of the night. Then there's no deal at all. "I thought you might say that." Kessler smiled, and it was the empty smile of a man who had stopped feeling human emotions long ago. "You always were stubborn. It's why you survived Mosul, and it's why you're going to die tonight. You want to know why I really came here?" Victor Sarah asked, her voice cutting through the rain. "It wasn't just for the files. It wasn't even just for Commander Harrington, although keeping him alive is important." She took a step forward, her rifle steady, despite the shaking that had plagued her hands for 3 years. "I came here because my brother died, believing in something. He died, believing that there were still people in this world worth saving, still causes worth fighting for. He died, believing that someone would eventually bring Blackwell to justice, that all the corruption and murder and betrayal would eventually come to light." Another step. Kessler's men shifted nervously, their fingers tightening on triggers. "He died, saving Commander Harrington's life, Victor. And I'll be damned if I let you finish what you started 3 years ago," touching Kessler said. But there was something uncertain in his eyes now, something that hadn't been there before. "But sentiment doesn't stop bullets." "No," Sarah agreed. "It doesn't." She moved. The gunfight that erupted was brief and brutal and absolutely decisive. Sarah's first shot took down the operative closest to Kessler, a clean headshot that dropped him before he could even react. Reaper and his team opened fire simultaneously, their limited ammunition spent with the precision of men who couldn't afford to waste a single round. Kessler's men returned fire, but they were off balance, surprised by the sudden violence after the standoff. 2 more went down in the opening exchange, and then Sarah was among them, too close for rifles, fighting with her hands and her knife, and every dirty trick she had learned in 20 years of combat. She killed one man with his own weapon redirected into his throat. She killed another by driving him backward into the spinning tail rotor of the helicopter, a death that was messy and loud and absolutely final. The remaining operatives broke and ran their nerve, failing in the face of something that seemed more like a force of nature than a human being. And then it was just Sarah and Kessler, standing in the rain on the blood-slicked helipad, circling each other like wolves. "You're better than I remembered," Kessler said, drawing a combat knife from his belt. "But I've gotten better too." He lunged, and the fight that followed was unlike anything Sarah had experienced since leaving the military. Kessler was faster than a man his size had any right to be, and he fought with a viciousness that came from years of living in the shadows. His blade opened a cut on Sarah's arm, then another on her shoulder, and she felt herself being pushed back toward the edge of the roof. He was winning. She could feel it in the weakness of her blocks, in the slowness of her reactions, in the blood loss that was making her vision blur at the edges. 3 years of retirement had taken more from her than she wanted to admit. But then Kessler made a mistake. He overextended on a thrust, putting too much confidence in his superior strength, and Sarah saw the opening she needed. She didn't block the knife. She let it come, let it slice a furrow across her ribs that burned like fire, and she used that moment of commitment to close the distance. Her hand found his wrist and controlled it, redirected the blade away from her body, and her other hand found the scalpel she had carried since the beginning of this nightmare. She drove it into the side of his neck, severing the carotid artery, and watched the light fade from Victor Kessler's eyes. "That was for Daniel," she whispered. Sarah stood over Kessler's body for a long moment, the rain washing his blood across the concrete and down the drains at the edge of the helipad. Then she turned and ran toward the helicopter, where Reaper was already helping Commander Harrington into the back seat. The pilot was slumped over the controls, killed in the crossfire. Sarah didn't hesitate. She climbed into the pilot's seat and started running her hands over the controls, trying to remember everything she had learned in thousands of hours of helicopter flights. "Can you fly this thing?" Reaper shouted over the engine noise. "I'm a pararescue jumper," Sarah shouted back. "We know enough to get home." The instrument panel was a nightmare of warning lights. Hydraulic pressure low, rotor RPM dropping, bullet holes in the windshield, and God knew where else. This helicopter had taken damage in the firefight, and Sarah had no idea how much more it could take. She grabbed the collective and pulled, feeling the aircraft shudder beneath her as it fought to lift off the helipad. The rotors screamed in protest, and for a terrifying moment she thought they weren't going to make it. Then the skids left the concrete, and they were airborne, lurching sideways in the wind, fighting for every inch of altitude. More gunfire from below, the surviving Blackwell operatives taking desperate shots at the escaping helicopter. Sarah heard rounds punching through the fuselage, felt the aircraft shudder with each impact, but she kept her hands steady on the controls and her eyes fixed on the sky ahead. "Everyone hold on," she said through gritted teeth. "This is going to be rough." She pointed the helicopter toward the lights of the city in the distance, toward safety, toward the end of a nightmare that had lasted 3 years. Behind them, the chaos of St. Jude's Hospital receded into the rain and darkness, and Sarah allowed herself to believe for the first time that they might actually survive. The helicopter crashed more than landed at the military airfield 15 miles outside Seattle. The engine gave out completely at 200 feet, and Sarah auto-rotated the dying aircraft down with nothing but skill and desperation, slamming onto the tarmac hard enough to collapse one of the skids and send the whole machine sliding sideways in a shower of sparks. But they were down. They were alive. FBI vehicles surrounded them within minutes. Black SUVs disgorging agents in tactical gear, who clearly had no idea what to make of the battered helicopter and its even more battered occupants. Sarah barely registered their presence as medics swarmed around Commander Harrington, stabilizing his wounds for transport to a proper medical facility. Knock. Reaper approached her where she sat on the rain-soaked tarmac, too exhausted to stand, and pressed something into her hand. A small velvet box. "The commander wanted you to have this," he said. "He said you earned it tonight." Sarah opened the box with trembling fingers and found a small golden pin in the shape of an angel wing. She looked up at Reaper with confusion in her eyes. "The squadron voted," Reaper explained. "You're not Angel anymore. That call sign belonged to a different woman, a woman who retired 3 years ago." He nodded toward the medics loading Harrington into an ambulance. "Your new call sign is Valkyrie, because tonight you chose who lived and who died." 1 week later, Sarah Brennan stood at the edge of a private airfield in Virginia, watching the sun set over the runway in brilliant shades of orange and gold. She looked nothing like the woman who had shuffled through the halls of St. Jude's Hospital in scrubs 2 sizes too big. The woman they had mocked and dismissed and called the mute. Tonight, she wore a form-fitting crimson-red dress that caught the fading light like liquid fire. Her blonde hair, freed from its severe bun, cascaded over her shoulders in soft waves. The cuts and bruises from the battle were healing, and she stood tall with the quiet confidence of someone who had faced the worst the world had to offer and emerged victorious. A black government sedan pulled up, and Sarah felt her heart tighten in her chest as the door opened. Derek Holloway stepped out first, wearing his dress uniform, and moved to open the back door. Commander Cole Harrington emerged slowly, leaning on crutches, but standing under his own power. He wore his full dress whites, the gold trident of a Navy SEAL gleaming on his chest. And despite everything he had been through, he looked like exactly what he was, an American hero. He walked towards Sarah, each step clearly painful but determined, until they stood face to face in the golden light of sunset. "They told me you declined the medal," he said softly. "I didn't do it for a medal, I did it for Daniel." Harrington nodded slowly, his green eyes bright with emotions that military men rarely allowed themselves to show. "He would be proud of you." He always said his sister was the toughest person he knew. He said if anything ever happened to him, you'd find a way to make it right. Sarah felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes. The first tears she had allowed herself in 3 years. "I just wish I could have saved him too." "You saved me," Harrington said. "And the files we recovered have already taken down 3 senators, half the defense board, and every executive at Blackwell Defense. The whole organization is being dismantled as we speak. Everything they built, everything they killed to protect, it's all coming down." He reached out and took her hand, pressing the small velvet box into her palm. "Daniel saved my life in that convoy. And you saved it again at St. Jude S. The Brennan family has given more than anyone should ever have to give." Sarah looked down at the golden angel wing in the box, and when she looked back up, Commander Cole Harrington was raising his hand to his forehead in a crisp military salute. Not as a commander to a subordinate, as a warrior to an equal. "Thank you," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "for everything." Sarah didn't salute back. Instead, she stepped forward and wrapped her arms around him, holding tight to this man who had been with her brother in his final moments, who had carried the burden of survival for 3 long years. "Thank you for being there when he died," she whispered. "Thank you for holding his hand." The legend of the nurse who was a soldier never left the halls of St. Jude's Hospital. Someone taped a blurry security camera photo to Sarah's old locker, showing a woman standing amidst smoke and chaos, holding a defibrillator paddle like a shield. Beneath it, someone had written one word in black marker: respect. Doctor. Preston Ashworth lost his medical license and now faces federal charges for fraud and negligence. Chad Morrison was seen helping a struggling new nurse carry boxes, his arrogance finally broken. And the doctors at St. Jude's never laughed at a quiet new hire again. As for Sarah Brennan, she looked at her hands one last time. They weren't shaking anymore. Commander Harrington had offered her a position with a new task force, no red tape, no administrators, just the mission. She looked at the horizon and smiled. "When do we start? The person mopping the floor might be the only one capable of saving your life." Sarah Brennan walked back into fire because that's what soldiers do. Not for medals, not for recognition, but because somewhere inside them the mission never ends. This story is a reminder that heroes don't always wear capes or uniforms. Sometimes they wear scrubs 2 sizes too big. Sometimes they shuffle through hallways and take the jobs nobody else wants. Sometimes they carry scars that no one can see and fight battles that no one will ever know about. And sometimes the person everyone underestimates turns out to be the only one standing between life and death. So here's my question for you. Have you ever misjudged someone based on their appearance? Have you ever dismissed the quiet person in the room only to discover later that they were carrying a strength you never imagined? Think about it. The next time you see someone who seems invisible, someone who doesn't demand attention or speak up for themselves, maybe take a second look. You never know what battles they've fought, what sacrifices they've made, or what they're capable of when the moment demands it. If this story gave you chills, if it made you think twice about the people you pass by every day, then do me a favor. Hit that like button right now. It takes 1 second, but it tells us that these stories matter, that you want to hear more about ordinary people doing extraordinary things. And if you haven't already, smash that subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another story like this one. We've got a new saga coming next week about a homeless chess player in Central Park who turned out to be a former grandmaster. He gave up everything, fame, fortune, his entire life because he discovered a secret that powerful people wanted to stay buried. Trust me, you don't want to miss it. Share this video with someone who needs to hear it today. Share it with a veteran. Share it with a nurse. Share it with anyone who has ever been underestimated or overlooked. Let them know that their strength matters, even when no one else can see it. Comment Valkyrie below if you made it to the end. And tell me who is the quiet hero in your life, who is the person that everyone else overlooks, but you know is capable of incredible things. Until next time, remember, never underestimate the quiet ones. They just might save your life.